Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for this Best Practices webinar. Today's webinar will focus on email deliverability, getting your message to the inbox of your readers. Before we get started, I want to review just a couple of things about your GoToWebinar interface. On your screen, you should see a GoToWebinar control panel like this one. And this is where you can select exactly how you want your audio set up, either to use headphones or to use the call-in feature on the telephone. If you have a question at any point during the webinar, we encourage you to use the little question panel here. Just ask your question there, and at the end of the session, we'll be reviewing any questions that come up during the webinar. And lastly, you have the ability to hide this control panel by clicking the orange button, and that'll move it out of the way. Let's review our agenda for today's webinar. We're going to talk about the road to the inbox, and the road to the inbox has several steps, and we're going to actually follow each one of those steps and talk a little bit about each one of them and how they affect your deliverability. We're going to talk specifically about how to manage search and the complexities that come with that. And then lastly, go through some steps that you can do to improve your deliverability. And finally, in the end, we'll do some question and answer. First thing we want to do is make sure everybody understands the language of email deliverability. So we're going to go through a couple of glossary terms and so that everybody's on the same page. First, you'll hear me mention ISPs. ISPs are internet service providers. These are companies that are out there providing a variety of different services, including online email. So when we think about folks that offer products such as Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo Mail, those are internet service providers that we're referring to. Next is an IP address. An IP address is simply a number, and it indicates the unique machine that is being accessed either by the user. So a student who's logging in to check their email, they have an IP address that they're using to do that, and each one of our servers has a unique IP address. IP is Internet Protocol, and that's just the unique identifier basically for every machine on the Internet. Next, we'll talk about a domain. Domains are important because that indicates the organization where mail is being sent from or sent to. So the part of your email address that identifies that is typically the part that comes right after the @ sign in your email. So for instance, if my address is keith@greenville.edu, the greenville.edu is the domain that we're referring to here. Next, we'll mention the canned spam legislation. This was legislation passed by the U.S. Congress that deals with sending marketing messages and particularly spam messages. So we'll make reference to that along the way. Opt-in, this is a term that is used to indicate that the student has given permission for email, and specifically it's talking about permission between one person and one organization. So when we talk about opting into messages, that's what we refer to there. So before we start the road to the inbox, the important thing is when we're sending mail that we're able to answer some fairly simple questions along the way. And these are the questions that are being asked by the internet service providers out there as they see mail coming from you. So first of all, who are you? Who do you claim to be if you're sending messages from one organization that says they're from another? Are you who you say you are? What is your reputation, and what is it that you're trying to say? These are the questions that we're going to be answering as part of this road to the inbox. So the road to the inbox starts when you send a message from Enrollment Manager. So when you go into the software and develop a marketing message, that message is going to go through several different steps along the way before it ends up in the student's inbox. And the first one that we're going to talk about today is the blacklist check. So the very first thing that happens is we're going to see if this mail needs to be blocked for any reason due to blacklisting. So a blacklist check, I mentioned before what an IP address is. Every networked computer is identified by an IP address on the internet. So one of the things that the ISPs are going to do when you send a message is they're going to look at the IP address that this particular message came from. And that's one of the ways that they're going to identify the sender for that email. So we're going to look at that IP address, and they're going to compare that IP address to a number of different blacklist services that are managed by different organizations out there. And those organizations are basically keeping track of IP addresses, servers, email senders who are known for generating spam. And that's one of the ways they're going to try to control spam. So a blacklist is basically a third-party organization manages those blacklists to filter, and different ISPs will then subscribe to those blacklist providers, and you'll see some of the names here down at the bottom. Basically, the whole goal of these blacklist providers is to block any unsolicited mail from being sent. That's their goal. There are hundreds of these different blacklist services out there. Only a few of them really matter. Those are some of the big ones that are listed down here at the bottom, like Spam House and Spam Cop, things like that. There are hundreds of them, though, so it may be that you'll find yourself on one of the more minor blacklist providers, and that's not necessarily reason to be overly upset, because there are so many of them, and different blacklist providers have different thresholds. For instance, you might have one student that complains about a spam message, and that could put you on a blacklist for some of these lesser known providers. The ones that are important, though, have a higher threshold and really do seek to block only the spammers out there. The most common that are used by ISPs are the ones listed here: Spam House, Spam Cop, and SORBS. As I mentioned, finding yourself on any particular blacklist doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem. Now, if you're on one of these big three, that probably does indicate a problem. There are ways to check for that online, and one of the ways that you can know that you've been listed in one of these is to check your bounces, bounced mail that comes back. Sometimes the bounce will indicate it's being bounced because your IP address was listed on a blacklist somewhere. Spam House is probably the most widely used, and you'll find some tools on their website to help if you ever have need to. So assuming your IP address was not on any kind of a blacklist, the next step is authentication. So authentication is answering the question, who do you claim to be? Now, we mentioned the IP address, but your domain is going to be associated with specific IP addresses. So, for instance, if my domain is greenville.edu, I might have a number of different IP addresses associated with greenville.edu. In this case, I might have the IP address 123.32.2352 that is specific to greenville.edu. Now, this is important because by default, the addresses that are associated with your domain are probably addresses on your campus. So when you send messages out from greenville.edu, it's being identified first by the domain name, and then any IP addresses that have permission to send that particular message out. Now, of course, since you're using a domain that's associated with Enrollment Manager, that's something that we're going to have to work on. So essentially, when mail is being sent from Enrollment Manager, you're actually borrowing one of our domains to do that. And we have a domain set up called cmmo1.com. That's the domain that actually is sending mail out to your students. Now, what we can do is we have to say, okay, your domain name, which is greenville.edu, is not the same as cmmo1.com. So what we have to do is grant permissions for our domain to send mail as if it were your domain. And that way, when we set up authentication, that means that greenfield.edu mail is equal to cmmo1.com email, and messages get through without a problem. That authentication step is something that we have great documentation on. There's instructions on setting up that authentication in our knowledge base under a topic called Initial Email Setup. And this will give you all the information you need to share with the folks on campus that are managing your domain so that they can get the right information set up and you won't have any problem with email deliverability as it relates to authentication. So the next step, once you have cleared the blacklist and authentication is not a problem, then what the ISPs will look at is reputation. So what is your reputation as an email sender? How ISPs view you and your mail is your reputation. So this is a kind of a mysterious area in terms of managing reputation. This is similar to a credit score. So if you charge anything and have credit accounts, you also have a credit score that indicates what your reputation is as a creditor. What this does, ISPs look at reputation in a very similar way. They're looking at your history, they're looking at things like that to determine how reputable you are as an email sender. Email reputation really is what controls access to the inbox. If you have a bad reputation as an email sender, your mail will go to a spam folder, or it may just be blocked altogether. Having a good reputation almost guarantees that your messages will make it to the inbox. So reputation is really a really critical thing. Reputation can be both domain and or IP address based. So having a good domain and having good IP addresses are the key to having a good reputation. Your reputation is really determined mostly by violations. So what ISPs are looking for are what are the things that have happened, with your mail that has caused problems in the past. And those problems are what are going to hurt your reputation. So let's look at some of the elements of the reputation. First of all, volume and consistency. So how much do you send? How much mail are you sending? What's the frequency? And is that particular flow of email real sporadic or is it real consistent? Because they're looking for patterns of behavior. For instance, if you have an IP address and a domain that has never sent much mail before, and then suddenly you're sending a couple 100,000 messages all at once, that could cause some serious red flags. So they're looking for IP addresses and domains that have sort of consistent behavior. The volume in and of itself is not good or bad, so it's not bad that you're necessarily sending a lot of mail, but if you're sending it in a sporadic fashion, that can hurt your reputation. Another big thing that hurts your reputation are hard bounces. If you're sending mail to addresses and a lot of it is bouncing back, that indicates to the ISPs one of two things. Either you're not really maintaining your list very well. In other words, people are moving, they don't have the email address anymore, they have indicated that they want to unsubscribe, things like that. Or it indicates that you've illegally purchased names from a source with lots of really bad or old email addresses. So having a really high bounce rate can affect your reputation. Another thing that affects your reputation are complaints. So most ISPs offer their users a spam button. If you send something to someone at AOL.com, they have a way very easily to indicate that that message is spam. So if they're using that button a lot on your mail, indicating that it's spam, those complaints come back and can affect your reputation. There are a number of third-party services that help sort of manage those kinds of complaints as well, and those third-party services can have an effect on your reputation. And then lastly, another element is your permanence or IP address stability. So for instance, how long have you been using the specific IP address that you have now? So for instance, let's say your college has been maybe sending a lot of mail locally from your campus computers and you've had problems with deliverability, and now you're trying to use a different IP address, and maybe that one you're getting in trouble with, and we're going to switch to a third IP address. That kind of instability can cause problems, and because the ISPs again are looking for stable, consistent kinds of volume and usage. Lastly, this is the spam trap violations. If your institution falls into what we call a spam trap, that could be one of the worst things, most devastating things to your reputation. And essentially what a spam trap means is that there are companies out there that maintain these spam traps for the purposes of identifying unsolicited mail. So they will put email addresses out on the internet which are specifically used for spam traps. And if somebody gets a hold of one of those email addresses, then sells that address to you, and you end up sending a message to that address, that's how you fall into a spam trap. And we've had colleges that have done that by purchasing disreputable data from different sources. And once you've landed in a spam trap, it's very hard to get out of those kinds of problems, because you've essentially, fallen into a trap where you have clearly sent messages to somebody who never requested it. So let's talk about maintaining a good reputation. How do we do that? Well, one is proper bounce handling. And fortunately for you, if you're using Enrollment Manager, the bounce handling is happening automatically. If we have students who have hard bounces, we're automatically going to unsubscribe those addresses so that you don't continue to send mail to an address that clearly is not working. Another thing you can do is continue to review your statistics. Look at your bounced addresses. Figure out where they came from. Find out, which services, if you're getting names from someplace, which services are giving you good data and which ones are not. Because really finding good data to begin with is a key to keeping and maintaining a good reputation. Next, staying true to permissions. So you obviously in Enrollment Manager have the ability to indicate not only who wants to get your mail and who doesn't, but we have Subscriber Center functionality that allows you to give power to the user to indicate the kind of mail that they want from you and the kind of mail that they don't. If you're using that Subscription Center functionality, you should have a great relationship with your readers, because you're only giving them what they want and you're not sending unsolicited messages. Next, don't send unexpected mail. And this is basically where there's a line between being an effective marketer and being a spammer. And if you're sending lots and lots of messages to students who have not really indicated any interest or much interest at all, and you're sending it at unexpected times, eventually those students are going to complain about you being a spammer and are going to indicate that there are problems. And then lastly, avoiding spam traps. And this is real easy to do if you follow just a few different things. I mentioned the spam traps. These are traps that are set out there to catch you, much like a speed trap that you would have the police setting for you to give tickets. This is a similar kind of a thing. They are basically setting a trap out there, just waiting for you to fall into it. And spam traps come from a number of different ways. Sometimes these companies will find an old address and reactivate it in terms of to make it into a spam trap. So maybe it's a domain that's no longer good but used to be good, and they're going to use that address. So if you're sending mail to that address, they know for a fact that this is somebody that has never opted into your particular message. Spam traps happen a lot with list purchases, so it's very important to only get data from reputable services. In building a good reputation, opt-in is the most important. So making sure that all of the students that are on your mailing lists are there because they have asked you for specific information. If people don't want your mail, your reputation is going to suffer because they're going to complain about your messages. Next is making sure you're complying with CAN-SPAM legislation. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But the CAN-SPAM legislation is really just a starting point. The CAN-SPAM provides some guidelines for sending mail and the types of messages that you should do, but you should really look at that as a starting point. Next is to honor your unsubscribes, and of course Enrollment Manager is going to do that for you as part of the functionality. If somebody unsubscribes, you're not going to be able to mail to them unless of course you overwrite those unsubscribes and try to keep sending messages to them. Removing addresses when they bounce is critical, and of course Enrollment Manager does that automatically as well. But make sure that you're not, overwriting that as well and sending messages to students who we know have bounced in the past. Make sure that you're unsubscribing people who file any kind of a spam complaint. And of course some of this happens automatically as well through Enrollment Manager, but you might have, for instance, people that will just respond to your message saying, don't send me any more mail or take me off your mailing list, things like that that have to be handled manually. Make sure that you're doing that and have somebody on your staff that's in charge of handling those unsubscribes. It's very, very easy to do in Enrollment Manager to manually unsubscribe someone, so make sure somebody's in charge of that. Next, don't play games with permissions. Permissions being the permissions that the student has given you. So if they have, specifically opted in for information about your institution, specifically for admissions, don't start sending lots of mail about, fundraising or about athletics or something else that may not be of interest to them. And this goes along with that, but sending people only what they expect to get from you. So if they're opting in as an admissions prospect, they're not expecting to get fundraising information, or they might not even be expecting to get, a campus newsletter that talks about things for faculty and things like that. So be careful only to send people what they're expecting to see. Use clear and easy to understand processes for opting in and unsubscribing. And again, Enrollment Manager makes this very, very easy to do as part of our standard templates. But make sure you're doing it for any other services that you might be using as well. And then lastly, if you're buying names of any kind, be very, very careful about where those names are coming from, the reputation of the vendor, and make sure that the names you're getting are clean. So let's get back to our road to the inbox. So after checking for blacklist and authenticating and assuming your reputation is sound, the next thing in your road to the inbox is content filtering. And content is something that used to be a lot more important. So for instance, it used to be that people would get very concerned about their subject line of their email or the content of their email, that they had, they weren't using spam associated words and phrases and things like that. Actually, that is much less important than it used to be. And this chart actually is showing you some of the major internet service providers that are out there and how they judge content versus reputation. And you'll see here, for instance, even the largest ISPs out there, like Yahoo, 80% of their weight goes to reputation, only 20% to content. So they really are not looking at the content nearly as much as they used to. And even some like AT&T, 90% reputation, and only 10% are they looking at content. AOL, who was once one of the largest providers, they're not quite as large as they used to be, but still got completely away from looking at content and judged their deliverability only on reputation. So as you can see here, reputation is really much, much more important than the content itself. That being said, there's some things that we need to know about content. First of all, Yahoo reports that they are currently blocking 60% of all the messages that they receive. Now, of course, a lot of the messages that they receive are legitimate spam, so that's why that number is so high. 40% of delivered mail is to the spam folder. So, and this again is from Yahoo, so 60% they're blocking, another 40% of what they deliver, they're delivering to the spam folder. So that's giving you an idea of how little mail that comes through the Yahoo servers actually gets delivered to the inbox. Spam and content filters erroneously will block 25% of all opt-in commercial email. So let me let that one sink in there for a little bit, because spam and content filters are erroneously blocking 25% of all commercial opt-in legal email. So, and you probably have experienced this too in your own inbox. You'll find mail that is clearly legal is going to your spam folder. So when content filtering does exist, what it's looking for are things like words and phrases. So words and phrases that match the characteristics of spam messages. Content filtering also spends a lot of time looking at attachments. So this is why we don't allow attachments for our bulk email. But if you are sending other email messages out and you are including attachments, know that those are a big target for content filtering. Content looks at the mail header. The mail header is where you're indicating who it's from, who it's to, and what the subject fields are. So even if the content of the body of your message is fine, it's also looking at things like the mail header. And then in the body of your message, it's looking for what we would call HTML anomalies. That's either sloppy coding, or messages that are really just one big image. Things like that have a hard time being delivered because ISPs really want to be able to see the content of the message. And if the content's all in a big image, it's more likely to be blocked. They're also looking at the color of the message. So for instance, if your text is white, that will alert ISPs that this could be spam, because essentially if you're delivering content where the text is white and the background is white, you're just hiding the body of your message, which is suspicious, obviously. So let's talk about the last step on the road to the inbox, and that is engagement. So engagement is important because that tells the ISPs what people are doing with your email message when you send it to them. And they use a study called heuristics. Heuristics basically are being used to refine their systems. They want to see what's being opened, what kind of messages are their users deleting before they even open them. So if you're sending messages to students and your messages are being deleted right from the inbox without ever being opened, the ISPs are monitoring that. They want to see that because that's suspicious. Next, they're looking at the open and click behavior. So how often do your messages get opened and clicked compared to other messages? And then historically, what does that look like? Because that's an important part of how valid your messages are. If you have messages that are being sent out that are not being opened, not being read, not being clicked, that eventually is going to catch up with you because the ISPs are monitoring that. And this is really where the future of reputation management is coming from, because the ISPs are getting more and more sophisticated about these kinds of things, that they're monitoring what's going on within their users' inboxes. So let's talk about some of the myths that are out there, because there are a lot when it comes to email deliverability. And I mentioned before the content and how little content is really used anymore for deliverability. So, but it used to be if you had words like free in your email content, or mortgage, or other pharmaceutical kinds of references, that was automatically going to trigger a spam filter. To some extent, some of those still are the case, but words like free are no longer a problem with deliverability. Another myth is that if I just change my IP address or my email provider, it's going to fix my deliverability issues. And we've seen this a lot from schools that have come to us because they had problems with deliverability using another service or another vendor. They moved to us thinking that was just going to solve all their problems because they were now sending messages from a new server. Well, if you're using the same domain name that you've always used before, some of those problems are actually going to be portable and they're going to come with you where you go. So changing those IP addresses or providers doesn't necessarily fix everything for you. It certainly might help, and it is a good first step to rebuilding your reputation, assuming you're going to do things differently with your new provider. Another myth is that as long as my messages are CAN spam compliant, they're going to make it to the inbox. And nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that the CAN spam regulations do not guarantee deliverability to the inbox because they really are very, very basic in terms of what your message should include and how you should respond to email messages. So I mentioned before the CAN spam guidelines are really just the very, very beginning. You really need to go much farther than that to get things delivered to the inbox. Next, being on a blacklist will cause my messages to get blocked, period, or sent to the spam folder. And again, that's not always the case. Being on a blacklist certainly will not help your deliverability, but depending on which blacklist it is, that doesn't necessarily completely rule you out of sending mail. Another myth is that we'll hear folks talk about getting whitelisted, that their service provider can just get me whitelisted with all the ISPs so that they know who I am and they know that all of my mail is always good. Well, the reality is there is no such thing as a whitelist. The best thing you can do is getting back to what we talked about earlier with authentication. Making sure that your domain is properly authenticated, properly set up to send mail from wherever your email provider is working. So for Enrollment Manager, we provide you all those instructions in our knowledge base so that when mail comes from your domain, it is set up ahead of time so that they know, the ISPs know that if mail comes from your domain but from our servers, everything is okay. That's the closest you can get to being whitelisted, is to being authenticated. So the big question is, what about search? Well, officially, search as we know it in college admissions is at odds with the CAN spam legislation. CAN spam is very specific about your opt-in being between a particular student and a particular organization. With search, obviously, the student is giving permission to the search provider, the College Board or ACT or organizations like that, to then share that information with colleges. But the legislation isn't sophisticated enough to keep up with scenarios like that. So officially, search is at odds with the CAN spam legislations. The key thing is that you need to know that search names are not prospects. These are not students who have specifically asked for information from you, so you should not treat them like a normal prospective student. You should treat them, as we refer to in Enrollment Manager, as suspects, people who may be interested in your institution. So we can send them a search message or two, and we can get a sense of whether they're interested in our organization or not. And if they're not, we're simply not going to continue to send mail to them. Search lists may include spam traps. We have seen this before. If schools have purchased names from services that may not be completely trusted, we've seen names come in that include spam traps. And as I mentioned before, this can be a big problem. So you have to be extremely cautious of where you're getting names of students from, and make sure that they have, reputable ways of obtaining those names and addresses, and make sure that the addresses are fairly new. You don't want to buy names from a service, that may have collected the name, several years ago. It needs to be current information. So when using a purchase list, as I mentioned, do it with caution. Make sure that you're only using the list when the subscribers are expecting your email. So just because you get a list of names from an organization doesn't mean that those students have necessarily asked for college information. If you're buying it from the College Board or from ACT, they're very careful to let the student know that this is the purpose, but other organizations may not be as deliberate as that. Another thing is to make sure you're demanding good, clean lists from your vendors. If you're getting messages or you're getting lists of names from vendors and you're seeing real high bounce rates or high unsubscribe rates, you need to go back to those vendors and let them know that the data that they're sending is not valid. It would be great if all of those vendors actually validated email addresses before they sold them. That they first of all check to make sure it was a valid email address. Truth is, they don't do that. We certainly wish that they did, but you can still be very demanding on those vendors. Those search names are expensive, and you need to make sure that you're getting good data. Also, ask for double opt-in names, no unauthenticated email addresses. Again, vendors don't usually do this, but it's okay to ask for it. Ask them to make sure that those names are valid before they send them. Next, when you are using purchase lists and you're sending mail to your students, make sure that the intent is very clear in the message. We assist a lot with our services when we're managing search for you, but for instance, we want you to make sure that at the very top of the message, you're indicating to the student why they're getting this message, where their name came from. That way, when the student sees the message, they know that it's okay that they receive this message. They're not going to mark it as spam automatically. They might still unsubscribe, but that's okay. We don't mind if they unsubscribe. We really don't want them to report it as spam. So a couple of proactive steps that you can take. One is to ensure your deliverability by building a good reputation. And that means making sure that you're authenticated. Again, I'm going to point back to our articles and our knowledge base. Make sure that you've taken those steps to authenticate your domain with our servers. Next, respect permissions. Use the Subscriber Center functionality that we deliver with Enrollment Manager. We don't force you to use that functionality, but we definitely encourage it, because that way you're giving the power to the student to determine what kind of mail they want from you and what kind of mail they prefer not to get from you. Use the validation in Enrollment Manager. This is new functionality that came out earlier last year, but it allows you to validate the message against certain spam services, spam checkers, things like that, even before you send the message out. So validation is a great first step that you can do. You don't need to do it with every message that you send, but if you're designing a new message or a new template and you want to test it out, validation is a great way to do that. It's built into the application. It only takes about 5 or 10 minutes to do, and you can not only see how that message is going to be received by different services like Gmail, but you can also see what that message looks like in each of those environments. Next, as I mentioned before, demand more from your purchase list vendors. It's okay to be demanding about these things. I think if every college became more demanding about their purchase lists, we would see better behavior from the list vendors. Don't send unexpected mail. So this is really a key thing, is when think about your own inbox and the messages that you receive. If you start getting a lot of mail from organizations that you're only loosely affiliated with, you realize that you don't want that mail anymore, and that's going to cause you to either unsubscribe or complain about those messages. So don't send things that are completely unexpected. Make sure that you're managing your unsubscribes and complaints as they come in, and quickly. And occasionally, it doesn't hurt to what we call reconfirm your list. And what this means is that if you have names that are on your list and you're not getting a lot of opens and click-throughs, send a confirmation message to those folks and say, look, you may not be interested in our organization anymore, and if you're not, just click here and we won't send you any more mail. If you are still interested, click here, and that'll confirm their interest in your organization. And if you have folks that just don't respond at all, let's take them off of your lists. Let's not send those folks email over and over again if they're really not interested. And then lastly, purging non-responders. If you've done a confirmation step like that, go ahead. It's okay to take people off of your list. If you've got folks that you have sent 4 or 5 messages to, they've never responded, they've never opened, they've never clicked, go ahead and unsubscribe those folks, or just take them off of your outreach lists and don't send them mail anymore. That'll really help your reputation overall. So now let's open it up for questions. I see we have a couple of questions that have already come in. First is, which search lists are best? and by search lists, I'm guessing you're talking about search vendors like the College Board, ACT, those kinds of services out there. And honestly, we can't endorse any of them. To be honest with you, none of them are particularly great because none of them really do a good job of authenticating their email addresses. We wish they did. If they only took the step to make sure that every email address that was collected for a test registration is valid, that would be great. But the truth is, none of them do that right now. So in terms of which lists are best, probably the best thing you can do is make sure that you're only buying fresh data. The freshest lists are the best ones because they're the ones that have been, the data's been collected the most recently. So for instance, if you're buying PSAT names and you're getting those names, in the winter for folks that just took the PSAT, that list is going to be much better than, for instance, buying an SAT list in the summertime that might have names that are, for folks that took the SAT a year and a half ago. Those are the kinds of lists that you have to be more cautious about. So fresher is always better. Another question came in about whitelisting on campus, and we didn't talk about this, but this is really a critical step. So when you are sending mail from Enrollment Manager, chances are you're going to have no problem getting that mail delivered to your students who use Gmail or Yahoo or AOL or things like that, but you might have problems actually getting it delivered to staff on campus, and that's because your campus firewalls and your campus mail services are going to be very suspicious of mail that comes from, let's say, greenville.edu, but isn't sent from a greenville.edu server. So that's where we can run into problems with whitelisting. And whitelisting is basically then a process where your email administrators on campus can okay mail that comes from Enrollment Manager. And that's a step. There's actually information about that as well in our knowledge base that I'll show you in just a second. Last question we had here is specifically about canned spam. So what is canned spam? Well, actually I do have a slide that I can share with you. We don't always get into the complete details about canned spam, but this gives you just a brief overview of the major components of the canned spam legislation. First of all, this is legislation that was passed back in 2003. And it has really these 7 major components to it. To be canned spam compliant, first of all, there's a lot of language in there about using false or misleading header information. So making sure that your from and your to and your reply to and those kinds of things are all valid. You're not trying to hide or mislead anybody about who the message is coming from. Next is deceptive subject lines, making sure that the subject accurately reflects what's in the message itself, which makes perfect sense. Identify the message as an ad. So again, if you're sending a message to a student and it's for the explicit reason of getting their interest, having them opt into further messages, things like that, just be real clear about it. And I mentioned this when we were talking about search. Be very clear in the body of your message, or even at the very top of the message, why it is the student's getting the message that they're getting. Next is that you have to tell students where you're located. A physical mailing address needs to be part of all of your bulk mailings. So your email should include your university name and your university physical mailing address. Next, it has to have a way for the students to opt out. And of course, in Enrollment Manager, your mail will always have an unsubscribe link into it or a link to the subscriber center. And then if you do get those unsubscribe requests, CAN-SPAM legislation requires that you honor them promptly, and typically within 10 business days. Again, Enrollment Manager is going to do that immediately, so you don't need to worry about that as much. And then lastly, a major component of CAN-SPAM is monitoring what others are doing on your behalf. So for instance, if you're hiring Ruffalo Cody to manage some of this mail for you, some of your search processes, things like that, this is where you need to be monitoring what it is that they're doing using your good name. So that's more about what CAN-SPAM is all about. Okay. Well, I think that answered all the questions that were submitted. Obviously, if you have additional questions, feel free to send those to our support team, and folks there will be happy to help you. Since I did make reference to our knowledge base, I just want to share that with you. If you go to our knowledge base, which is at help.422x.com, you will see under email marketing a page called Initial Email Setup. And this is really the page you can just share with folks on your campus that manage your post office for email, your postmaster. They'll know exactly what to do with this to set up the email address to be authenticated. So don't worry about if you don't understand everything in this particular page. This is really designed for folks that manage the domains for your university. So just share this with them and they should be able to set up exactly what you need. This also provides the what we call the whitelisting overview, and this is how and why your mail should be whitelisted to be able to send mail to your staff on campus. So I'll make reference to both of those pages in our knowledge base. So I just want to say thank you for participating in this webinar. We had some great questions and great feedback, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future. And we hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.